Okay, let's unpack this. Decentralized lending, it promises this unparalleled capital efficiency, right?
Right.
But if you're actually looking to, maximize your yield and minimize risk, especially in a modular system like Morpho,
Yeah.
well, you quickly realize the decisions get pretty
Oh,
complex.
absolutely. Choosing the right protocol version, the optimal layer 2, the safest vault configuration, it can feel overwhelming.
Yeah, it feels less like just straightforward yield farming and maybe more like risk engineering.
That feeling, though, that's kind of the cost of sophistication, isn't it? When you leverage modularity, you get incredible efficiency, sure, and the ability to really customize your risk exposure, but you definitely inherit that critical decision-making burden. You shift from being, let's say, a passive depositor in a big DAO-governed pool
Right.
to being a more sophisticated user, someone
hmm
who really has to audit the strategy, the governance of the specific financial product you're using.
And that is exactly our mission today. We're aiming to provide that essential shortcut, if you will, for you, the listener, who wants to go deep into the Morpho ecosystem. We really need to define the strategic decisions required to move from being maybe a basic DeFi user to an expert Morpho lender.
Mm-hmm.
So we've pulled together the crucial source material. We've got the chain security audit of the Morpho Vault V2 contracts, detailed liquidation docs, and recent 2025 data on layer 2 gas markets and those important wallet integrations.
Yeah, and our focus is definitely strategic here. We're drilling down on the architecture, the key difference between Morpho Blue and Morpho Vaults. Then there's the operational reality, like secure access via hardware wallets, Ledger, Tangem, those kinds of things. And critically, the deep, almost forensic due diligence you need to do to pick a truly safe, high-performing vault in this, well, expanding ecosystem.
Okay, so let's start with that central structural challenge, Morpho's architecture. This really answers that foundational question for any new user. How do I pick the right version of the protocol for my goals?
Yeah.
So when we talk about Morpho Blue, we are talking about a trustless primitive. That's the term, right?
Exactly. It's not a lending pool in the way we usually think about it. It's designed to be this immutable, governance-minimized base layer, purely for capital efficiency.
That philosophical shift seems fundamental.
It really is. Traditional lending protocols, they're basically like these large multi-asset banks. They rely on a centralized DAO for everything, risk management, listing assets, contract upgrades.
Yeah.
Morpho Blue, though, it's different. It's kind of an unopinionated machine. Its entire design is built around isolating risk.
Okay, isolating risk. How does that actually happen? What are the mechanical differences compared to just a big shared pool?
Well, the isolation happens through its elementary market structure. So in traditional pools, if you deposit, say, USDC, your capital might suddenly be exposed to the risk of, I don't know, 20 different collateral assets.
Right, everything all mixed together.
Morpho Blue breaks that down completely. Every single market is isolated. It pairs only one loan asset with one collateral asset, like USDC lent against WETH, that's it. The person creating the market specifies everything. The loan token, the collateral token, the oracle they want to use, an immutable interest rate model, the IRM, and the really crucial liquidation loan to value, the LLTV.
Okay, I get the isolation part, but what's the direct capital efficiency gain for me, the lender? Where do I see the benefit?
Okay, so the first major gain is you get rid of what's called embedded rehypothecation. In protocols like Aave, the collateral someone puts up, it's often made available for other people to borrow.
Yeah.
That adds complexity, right? And liquidity risk if there's a big spike in liquidations. In Morpho Blue, the collateral just stays. It stays fully liquid right there in the contracts.
Right.
And this design allows the utilization rate, how much of the deposited funds are actually being borrowed, to average significantly higher. Because the protocol isn't worried about needing that collateral for both withdrawals and other borrows at the same time.
So higher average utilization means?
More consistent interest income for you, the lender. It prevents those sudden rate spikes you often see in other systems when liquidity gets tight.
And this structure, it also seems to solve that generalized risk problem through more precise LLTVs. Because if a pool has USDC collateralized by everything from, volatile meme coins to stable assets, the LLTV has to be super conservative for everything.
Precisely. That's a huge point. In the pooled model, the LLTV, that collateral threshold that triggers liquidation, it's always a compromise across totally uncorrelated assets. It forces these conservative caps. Morpho Blue defines the LLTV per market. So if you create a market pairing, say a USDC loan, against a highly correlated asset like Raft's collateral, you can safely set a much more efficient, much higher LLTV.
Right, compared to pairing USDC against some brand new super volatile governance token.
Exactly. And that granular risk definition, it translates directly to better collateral ratios for the borrower, which drives up borrowing volume, and consequently, you get better interest accrual for the lender. It's a win-win driven by precision.
And since the protocol is completely Oracle agnostic, the market creator gets to pick the price feed they trust. Chainlink, Uniswap, TWAP, maybe even a custom Oracle, further customizing that risk profile for their specific market.
Right. So the target user for interacting directly with Morpho Blue, it's pretty specialized. You're talking highly sophisticated lenders, institutional players, maybe low-level protocol integrators. They want absolute granular control over every single parameter, the specific oracle, the IRM, the LLTV. If you, the listener, are just looking for yield without building your own complex risk infrastructure, well, you probably skip this base layer.
Okay, so that brings us naturally to the abstraction layer, Morpho Vaults v2, often called Metamorpho. If Blue is the raw, trustless building block, then the vaults are more like the curated financial products.
That's a great analogy. The Vaults protocol is designed specifically as a non-custodial risk management layer built right on top of Morpho Blue. What it does is abstract away all that complexity of managing multiple isolated markets, actively monitoring their performance, all that stuff.
So for the passive lender,
For the passive lender, you just deposit a single asset, say USDC again. And the vault manager, the curator or allocator roles we'll get into, directs that capital to the best performing, compliant Morpho Blue markets automatically.
and this directly addresses what you mentioned earlier, that big risk problem of traditional lending,
Yeah.
the one-size-fits-all risk pool.
Exactly. Vaults enable risk segmentation. This is key. Instead of being exposed to every single asset risk that, say, a LAVE allows, you can choose a USDC vault that's specifically curated to lend only to stable, high-quality, maybe RW or collateralized markets.
Or the opposite.
Or the opposite. You could choose a different vault that deliberately targets highly volatile, maybe higher APY crypto-native markets like ETH-STETH pairs. The ability to choose your exposure precisely by selecting a vault that matches your risk appetite. That's the primary strategic selling point here.
Okay, now let's dive into the deeper mechanics of vault risk, because this is something the listener absolutely needs to understand. There's a really critical distinction in how bad debt gets handled, depending on the underlying adapter version the Vault v2 is using.
Oh.
We have to differentiate between Metamorpho v1.0 and v1.1.
Yeah, this is a nuance point, but it drastically affects the user's reality, operationally speaking. Morpho Vaults v1.0 implements a pretty robust mechanism for handling bad debt. You know, when a borrower defaults and the collateral isn't quite enough to cover the debt. In v1.0, that loss is accounted for and realized instantly. It gets socialized proportionally among all the lenders in the vault at that exact moment.
Right.
This ensures the market can basically run indefinitely without accumulating this hidden, unrealized debt.
That sounds like the ideal scenario for a passive lender, right? Guaranteed instantaneous loss sharing.
It is, generally speaking, but Morpho Vaults v1.1 handles it differently. It behaves a bit more like traditional lending pools, at least in the short term. The source material shows v1.1 does not realize bad debt instantly. Instead, the loss just kind of accrues in the underlying market. The actual realization only happens upon the next deposit or withdrawal transaction that hits that market.
Wait a second. If the v1.1 loss isn't instantly socialized, doesn't that fundamentally introduce a bank run risk?
Yeah.
Even within the Morpho ecosystem?
It absolutely does. That's the crucial implication. If the underlying market incurs a significant loss, a very informed, very reactive lender could see it coming or see it happen and redeem their shares before that loss gets formally realized by a transaction.
So they get out clean.
They get out clean, they escape the impairment entirely,
Yeah.
and the remaining lenders. They then absorb the entirety of that loss when the next user, maybe making a small deposit, triggers the realization function. This specific risk, the ability for these reactive users to escape losses, it's formally acknowledged in the audit findings. It's a key factor when you're deciding which v1 adapter version of v2 Vault is using. Choosing a v1.1 adapter vault means you either accept the need to be highly reactive yourself, or you accept the risk that passive users might bear disproportionate losses during these solvency events.
Okay, this moves us from the architectural theory into more practical strategy. Let's say we've chosen our preferred vault, maybe a risk-managed v1.0 adapter vault for peace of mind. Now we need to figure out, how do I actually access it securely? And critically, how do I pick the best or maybe just the cheapest layer 2 solution for my transactions? Hashtag tag tag 2.1 hardware wallet access and supported assets.
Right, security always starts with the hardware wallet. For users prioritizing self-custody, what Ledger is doing is pretty significant. Ledger has integrated Morpho as basically the default DeFi earn solution directly within their Ledger Live ecosystem.
That sounds huge for accessibility. It means the user doesn't have to mess around with complex dApps or custom interfaces, at least initially.
Exactly. It lowers the barrier to entry significantly. Now, the initial pilot focus was mainly on USDC and USDT stablecoin lending yield, primarily on Ethereum Layer 1.
Okay.
But the integration really points towards broader L2 expansion down the line. The whole process is designed to be seamless within Ledger Live. You can acquire assets, swap them if you need to, and then trigger the deposit transaction right into the Morpho vault. And crucially, that final signature required for the deposit, it's executed and secured by the Ledger device itself.
What about users of other, maybe newer hardware solutions like Tangem? Their interface is quite different, right? NFC-based signing.
Yeah, accessing Morpho with a Tangem wallet relies entirely on the established Wallet Connect standard. It's basically a two-step process. First, on your desktop or mobile browser, you navigate to the Morpho dApp, initiate the connection usually by scanning a QR code with the Tangem app.
Okay, standard Wallet Connect flow.
Right. And second, when you actually initiate the core activity, like approving the USDC token spending limit
Yeah.
or confirming the final deposit, the Tangem app sends that transaction payload to your physical card via NFC. You sign by tapping the card against your phone, often requiring Face ID or fingerprint authentication for that extra layer of security.
Got it. And regarding the actual assets you deposit, do I need ETH? Or can I just use something like USDC?
No, you generally don't need ETH unless, the specific vault you chose somehow requires ETH as the loan asset itself, which is less common for these yield strategies. The vaults are primarily built around accepting stablecoins. The Ledger pilot confirms that focus on USDC and USDT. Vaults are designed to accept a single asset, any token that implements the standard decimals function, basically. Since the whole goal is earning high yield from lending against collateral like WETH, STETH, or maybe RWAs, stablecoins like USDC are the main assets liquidity providers bring.
So you deposit the stablecoin.
Right. You use your chosen L2's native gas token like ETH on Arbitrum or Base just to pay the transaction fee, but the actual deposit into the vault is the stablecoin itself.
Okay, let's pivot to cost optimization. We're generally moving beyond Ethereum L1 for regular activity because of those high fees.
Yeah.
Morpho vaults are expected to expand across chains, and that strategic decision about which L2 to use becomes really crucial for cost-conscious DeFi activity. But the L2 gas market, it's not simple, is it? It's more like a complex microeconomy driven by competition.
That's the perfect way to frame it.
Yeah.
While L2 transactions generally cost, fractions of a penny, sometimes a few cents for complex stuff, the stability and predictability of that cost can vary wildly between networks. You really need to understand the microeconomics of base fees versus priority fees.
Our 2025 data highlights this really striking asymmetry in L2 revenue. Base, which is Coinbase's Layer 2, is often a massive daily revenue driver. It frequently outpaces competitors like Arbitrum significantly. Why does that revenue gap exist, and what does it actually mean for me, the individual depositor, just trying to save a few cents on gas?
That revenue gap is almost entirely driven by priority fee dominance. On networks that see massive DX activity, like Base, our sources indicate that these priority fees, basically tips paid to validators to get your transaction included faster, make up an astonishing 86.1% of its daily revenue.
Wow, 86%.
Yeah. It means Base is operating much closer to a volatile L1-style bidding market during peak times.
So if I, the listener, need to deposit, say, $10,000 into a vault quickly during high traffic hours, maybe when the U.S. market is really active, I might end up paying significantly higher fees on Base, just because I have to outbid sophisticated traders and MEV bots to get my transaction through fast.
Exactly right. That 86.1% dominance means fee volatility can spike really quickly, maybe to 0, 10 cents, or even more per transaction in those peak moments, and that completely negates the typical L2 cost advantage. So the strategic choice here becomes, do you prioritize the lowest theoretical minimum cost, which might be Base during off-peak hours, or do you prioritize stability and predictability for your standard deposits?
Okay, so where does that stability tend to lie in the current L2 landscape based on the data?
Well, you might find Arbitrum or Optimism offer more stable, more predictable transaction costs for routine, non-time critical deposits. We see that while optimistic MEV maximal extractable value consumes over 50% of the on-chain gas on both Base and Optimism, It's only around 7% on Arbitrum.
Only 7% on Arbitrum. That's a big difference.
It is. It suggests that Arbitrum blocks are generally less contested by those aggressive MEV transactions, potentially offering a smoother fee curve for standard users just trying to access a Morpho vault without getting caught in a bidding war.
We also can't forget the huge technical impact of EIP 4844, right? That fundamentally changed delta pricing across the board.
Oh, absolutely. That's the underlying factor keeping all L2s competitive now. The Denkun upgrade introduced blobs, which drastically reduced the cost for L2s to post their transaction data back to Ethereum L1 for security. This lowered L2 rollup fees by like 50 to 90% pretty much everywhere.
Huge savings.
Massive. And furthermore, ZK rollups like ZK Sync or Starknet, while they do incur some proof generation costs, which can raise the base transaction price a tiny bit under very heavy load, they also benefit immensely from these lower data posting costs via blobs. So if Morpho vaults expand onto ZK rollups, they could offer another excellent alternative, really leveraging that EIP 4844 efficiency in data finalization.
So the takeaway isn't simply L2X is the cheapest, but more like L2X might be the cheapest if you can handle the fee volatility, whereas L2Y might be more predictable for standard deposits. You need to match it to your needs.
Precisely. It's about understanding the trade-offs.
Okay, we've covered the protocol layers, we've covered operational access. Now we reach what might be the most critical section for risk management: the deep vault due diligence. If the Morpho Blue primitive itself is trustless, then the vault layer is where that risk shifts squarely onto human governance. We need the answer. How do I actually identify the top performing and the safest vaults out there? How do I research them effectively? Hashtag 3.1 due diligence on vault governance and strategy.
Right. The very first step before you even look at APYs is to completely understand the vault's trust model. The safety of your capital depends almost entirely on the transparency, the competence, and the incentives of the human roles governing that specific vault.
Okay, let's break down these semi-trusted roles, maybe starting from the top, the highest authority.
So you have the owner. This is typically the initial deployer of the vault contract. They hold the keys to set the other critical roles, the curator and the sentinels. Now, the risk here is that a malicious owner could, theoretically, eventually acquire the allocator privileges and then attempt to drain funds by setting up a malicious adapter.
Okay, that sounds bad.
It does, but the crucial safety feature here is the time lock. Any critical action that could potentially compromise user funds, things like setting or unsetting adapters, changing fees, all of those actions are subject to a mandatory time lock, usually somewhere between 24 hours and maybe 2 weeks.
So that's your exit window. If you see a suspicious change proposed, you have time to get out before it executes.
Exactly. It provides transparency and an escape hatch. So the vault is non-custodial in the sense that the smart contract holds the funds, not the team.
But the governance risk means we're essentially swapping broad DAO governance risk for the specific risk of trusting this particular team and their time lock setup.
Precisely. Next down the chain is the curator. Think of them as the risk strategist for the vault. Their main job is to whitelist the specific Morpho Blue markets that the vault is allowed to allocate capital to. They also set the supply caps, the maximum amount of liquidity the vault can put into each of those whitelisted markets. So you're trusting the curator to do their homework, verify that the whitelisted markets use legitimate oracles, have safe interest rate models, and importantly, have adequate initial liquidity to prevent certain attacks we'll discuss.
Okay, curator sets the strategy, then the allocator manages the day-to-day flows.
Right. The allocator manages how the funds are actually allocated among the curator's pre-approved whitelisted adapters. They're dynamically shifting capital, trying to find the best yield within the strategy defined by the curator. Their specific risk exposure for users is tied to that emergency exit mechanism we touched on earlier. If a malicious allocator sets a non-whitelisted adapter as the main liquidity adapter, well, they can't directly steal the funds, but they can temporarily block standard withdrawals by making the standard withdrawal function revert. This forces any user who wants their money back right now to use the penalized force deallocate function.
Got it. Creates friction and a penalty. And finally, the Sentinel. That sounds like an emergency role.
It is. The Sentinel acts as the emergency brake, the immediate response unit. They are expected to monitor the underlying markets constantly. If there's an emergency, a rapid market downturn, a vulnerability discovered, or maybe a malicious time-locked action pending from the owner allocator, the Sentinel can act instantly to decrease supply caps or deallocate liquidity from risky adapters.
So they're the last line of defense.
Pretty much. So when you're researching a vault, doing intense due diligence on the actual names and reputations of the curator and allocator teams, checking their public profiles, their track records, it's absolutely paramount. They define your ultimate safety within that vault structure. Hashtag checks, hashtag 3.2 financial incentives and fee structures.
Okay, so once we've hopefully established some governance credibility, we obviously need to look at the financial performance and, importantly, the fee structure that's going to eat into that performance. What are the main types of fees users need to watch out for?
There are typically two primary fees, the performance fee and the management fee. The performance fee is taken as a percentage of the accrued interest that the vault actually earns. This is usually capped. The protocol enforces a maximum of 50%, but you'll see lower figures in practice.
Okay, a cut of the profits.
Right. And then there's the management fee. This is taken as an annualized percentage of the total assets under management in the vault, your principal included. This is also kept by the protocol at a maximum of 5% APR, but again, you'll likely see much lower rates.
Got it. And the technical way interest accrues, that's also important for understanding how consistent your APY might be, isn't it? There was a change from V2 to V3.
Yes, that was a significant reliability improvement in the V3 contracts. Interest is now computed directly from the underlying adapter values, and crucially, it accrues automatically before any deposit or withdrawal transaction occurs.
So no more manual triggering.
Right, it removed an old V2 mechanism called VIC. This guarantees much more consistent fee calculation and ensures the net APY you see reflects the real-time performance more accurately. And one more safety feature related to rates. The allocator, or sometimes the curator, depending on the exact vault version, sets a max rate. It's capped by the protocol at 200% APR. This isn't about limiting your upside, it's actually a safety mechanism to prevent the share price from inflating incredibly rapidly, which could happen from, say, large unexpected external donations or potential manipulation. Hashtag tag 3.3 critical security checks for solvency, the inflation attack.
Okay, let's pivot now to some of the really deep security findings, particularly from that chain security audit. Let's focus on a major vulnerability that's inherent to any ERC 4626 standard vault, which includes Morpho vaults. The inflation front-running attack. This sounds like exactly the kind of sophisticated risk the average user might miss, but absolutely needs to understand.
It is. This is a critical point of vulnerability, especially for vaults that are brand new or have very, very low initial liquidity. The attack basically exploits the way the vault calculates the exchange rate between the underlying asset you deposit, like USDC, and the vault shares you receive.
Okay, walk us through how an attacker would actually pull this off.
All right, so an attacker finds a vulnerable, near-empty vault. They first deposit a tiny, almost negligible amount, let's say $1 worth of USDC, just enough to mint a few shares for themselves.
Okay, they're in.
Now, the crucial step. They execute a direct, large donation of the underlying asset, USDC, straight to the vault contract address, completely bypassing the standard deposit function. Let's say they donate $1 million USDC. Because this donation didn't come through the deposit function, no new shares are minted corresponding to that $1 million. But the vault's total assets just went up by $1 million. This artificially inflates the price of each existing share massively.
Ah, because the total assets grew hugely, but the number of shares barely changed.
Exactly. The share price skyrockets. Now imagine a legitimate user comes along shortly after and deposits, say, $100,000 of USDC using the normal deposit function.
Their transaction goes through.
Their transaction executes, yes. But the vault calculates the shares they should receive by dividing their $100,000 deposit by the now enormously inflated share price.
And because the share price is so high.
The result of that division, especially if the underlying token has few decimals, might round down to 0 shares or a practically meaningless fraction of a share.
So they deposit $100 and get nothing back in shares.
Essentially, yes, or close enough to nothing. The attacker can then simply withdraw their initial tiny $1 deposit, redeeming their few shares, which are now worth a fortune because they represent ownership that donated $1 million plus the victim's $100 K. They've effectively stolen the new depositor's funds via this front-running inflation attack.
Wow, okay, that's scary. So how do we, as sophisticated users, make sure the vault we choose is protected against this?
Protection requires a two-pronged strategy, and this is clearly outlined in the audit findings. First, responsibility lies with the vault deployers and curators. Their defense is what's called the initial dead deposit strategy. When deploying the vault, they must make a non-trivial initial deposit. The audit suggests something like 0.1 tokens or maybe 1/17 way for an 18 decimal token like WETH. And crucially, send it to an irretrievable address like a known burn address, 0xDead.
Why is it irretrievable?
because this ensures the vault is never truly empty from the moment of creation. It establishes a base level of liquidity and a non-zero share supply owned by nobody. This base dilutes any subsequent donation attempt, making it impossible for an attacker to inflate the share price significantly enough to perform the attack. If you check a vault on-chain and can't find evidence of this protective initial deposit, that's a massive red flag.
Okay, that's on the vault team. What about for me, the user, when I'm actively depositing?
You, the user, have a responsibility too. You must implement share price verification on your end before confirming the deposit. Don't just blindly trust the vault's deposit function or the UI estimate. You need to calculate, off-chain or in your transaction simulation, the minimum number of shares you expect to receive based on the current real asset balance and share supply. Then set a maximum acceptable slippage limit above the theoretical 1.1 ratio or whatever the fair rate is.
And if the number of shares the transaction preview shows is below my minimum acceptable threshold,
You must treat that transaction as potentially hostile and reject it immediately. Don't proceed.
and this diligence has to cascade downwards, right? The safety of the V2 vault depends on the safety of every single underlying Morpho V1 adapter or Morpho Blue market it uses.
Absolutely. The curator's due diligence checklist must include verifying this dead liquidity rule for every single underlying component. They need to confirm that the base Morpho Blue markets or the V1 vaults being used also had significant initial liquidity that was minted without inflation and is also irretrievable. If the foundation is vulnerable, the entire V2 structure built on top is compromised by this front-running risk. Hashtag 3.4 inherent risk acceptance.
Okay, let's quickly revisit that other risk we mentioned, the one about highly reactive lenders being able to escape losses in certain vault types. The chain security audit actually documented this, right? CS Morpho VLT2001, users can escape losses. You said this isn't a bug, but more like an acknowledged design choice.
That's correct. It's tied to the speed of loss realization, specifically in those V1.1 adapter scenarios we discussed, where losses aren't instantly socialized.
It still sounds a bit counterintuitive for a lending protocol to essentially reward the fastest person out the door, potentially punishing the more passive, maybe loyal lender.
It does highlight that fundamental difference between instantaneous socialization, like in V1.0 adapters, and realized socialization in V1.1. In that V1.1 scenario, a user who is extremely reactive, maybe running bots to monitor the underlying market health very closely, can indeed redeem their shares after a loss event occurs, but before the next transaction realizes that loss and adjusts the share price downwards.
So they get out at the pre-loss price. They watch the share price drop when the loss eventually gets booked.
Exactly. And then, potentially, they could even deposit again at the new lower price, effectively preserving their initial capital while others took the hit.
So they successfully transfer a higher percentage loss onto the shareholders who remained in the vault during that critical window.
Yes. And according to the documentation and responses, Morpho Labs views this as an intended behavior. The rationale is that it creates a strong incentive for transparency and for losses to be realized quickly across the entire system, because sophisticated users will race to exit if they anticipate issues.
Okay, so for you, the listener, what this practically means is if you choose a vault that utilizes a V1.1 adapter, your operational reality involved either being highly reactive yourself, monitoring liquidity ratios, market health, maybe even hourly, or
you have to place significant trust in the Sentinel role. You're relying on them to use their immediate powers, decreasing caps, deallocating from risky adapters to act as your proxy, performing that reactive risk management on your behalf before losses mount or become escapable.
Right, we've chosen a vault, done our due diligence, made the deposit, we've established the position. Now, how do we reliably monitor how things are going? And crucially, how do we guarantee we can get our funds out when we need to? Hashtag 4.1, monitoring your investment.
Yeah, monitoring solvency used to be a bit of a friction point, particularly in the older V2 contracts. If no one explicitly called the realized loss function after a bad debt event, the reported total assets value could actually become inflated, potentially masking underlying insolvency.
Right, that created a potentially significant liability gap for users relying on that number.
Exactly. The V3 contracts largely eliminated that ambiguity. Since V3, the total assets function is designed to consistently return the actual current value managed by the vault. This includes accrued interest and any realized losses. Because, as we discussed, losses are now realized automatically whenever interest is accrued, which happens before every single deposit or withdrawal. You get a much clearer, much more real-time picture of the vault's solvency directly from the contract.
Okay, that's a big improvement for on-chain visibility. However, We probably shouldn't rely solely on glossy front-end applications or dashboards, especially if we're managing significant capital, right?
Absolutely not. That's a key operational security point. Front-end applications, even the official Morpho consumer app, inevitably introduce latency risks. Data can be delayed, it might be incomplete occasionally, or it could simply contain display errors or bugs. For anyone managing large amounts of capital, independent, perhaps automated on-chain verification using the contract's public functions is really the gold standard for monitoring. You should be checking total assets regularly against your initial deposit value and your expected APY accrual. Don't just trust the UI, hashtag tag poor 4.2 cashing out, withdrawal versus emergency exit.
Okay, so when it's time to withdraw funds, under normal circumstances, the standard ERC 4626 functions withdraw for underlying assets, redeem for shares, handle the process smoothly. They primarily draw from any idle liquidity sitting in the vault. Or, if needed, they'll trigger a standard deallocation from the underlying market adapter to free up capital.
Right. But we absolutely need to discuss the non-standard exit mechanism, the one designed to protect users specifically from malicious or incompetent governance actions, the force deallocate function. This is really the ultimate safety valve, ensuring users can always get their underlying assets back, even if a rogue allocator tries to lock up the capital.
Okay, under what specific conditions would a user actually be forced to use this emergency exit? Why wouldn't the normal withdrawal work?
The main scenario is if the allocator maliciously, or perhaps even accidentally, sets a non-whitelisted or maybe just a broken or non-functioning adapter as the vault's primary liquidity adapter. In this situation, when you try a standard withdrawal, the call to deallocate within that function will likely fail, causing the entire withdrawal transaction to revert. You can't get your funds out the normal way. The only guaranteed path out becomes forced deallocate.
Got it. So it bypasses the faulty adapter setting. This sounds essential, but you mentioned a penalty earlier. What's the catch for using this emergency function?
Yeah, to prevent people from abusing this escape hatch, maybe using it strategically, even when normal withdrawal works, the user triggering force deallocate is subject to a penalty fee. This fee is capped by the protocol at 2% of the shares they are redeeming.
Okay, up to 2%. And where do those penalized assets go?
They don't just disappear and go to the protocol. The assets redeemed from this penalty are immediately added back into the vault's total assets. So the penalty is effectively distributed as a small yield bonus to all the remaining loyal shareholders who didn't trigger the emergency function.
Okay, so it disincentivizes unnecessary use while guaranteeing an exit path and rewards those who stay.
Exactly. It aims to ensure stability while providing that crucial escape route.
And finally, just a quick word of caution on those gate functions mentioned in the docs.
Yes, good point. The receive assets gate and shares gate. If these are activated on a vault, they represent fully trusted roles. While they might have legitimate uses, maybe for certain compliance scenarios or institutional vaults, they possess the ultimate power to potentially prevent users from exiting the vault entirely or from receiving their underlying assets upon withdrawal or redemption.
So extreme caution needed there.
Absolutely. Any vault that utilizes these gate mechanisms requires absolute uncompromising trust in the controllers of those specific gate contracts. It overrides the standard non-custodial assumptions.
Okay, let's try and position Morpho vaults within the broader competitive DeFi landscape now. Thinking about rewards and risks, how does this modular risk structure of Morpho actually compare to the more centralized structures we see in traditional players like Aave or Compound? And then, maybe relatedly, how do Morpho vaults stack up against pure yield aggregators, things like Yearn or Beefy, hashtag 5.1 Morpho vaults versus traditional lending pools?
Yeah, the comparison really boils down to risk centralization versus risk segregation. That's the core difference. Traditional pools like Aave and Compound, they centralize all the risk management within their DAO. The DAO decides which assets get listed, sets the risk parameters like LLTVs, manages upgrades. This inevitably restricts the number of supported assets because the DAO has limited bandwidth and needs to be conservative. And it forces this broad, kind of averaged out, conservative risk return profile that gets applied to all depositors in the pool.
Right, so if one obscure asset in the Aave pool suddenly becomes super risky,
Yeah.
everyone who deposited USDC into that pool is exposed to that risk, even if they never intended to interact with that obscure asset.
Exactly. Morpho Blue, as we said, externalized all that risk definition. And the vaults layer then reaggregates liquidity, yes, but it does so with custom parameters for each vault.
And the key is that this vault layer enables risk separation.
That's the crucial advantage. A user can consciously choose a high-yield, potentially high-risk vault focusing on volatile crypto pairs. Their loss exposure is entirely separate, completely firewalled from a passive lender who chooses a different low-risk vault focused only on RWA collateral. Even if both users deposited the exact same asset, like USDC, into the Morpho ecosystem.
That level of granular risk choice is just fundamentally unavailable in those big monolithic traditional pools.
Correct.
Okay, let's get technical for a moment on efficiency.
Mhm.
Liquidation mechanisms. How does Morpho Blue's static liquidation incentive factor, the LIF, potentially improve upon the traditional pool model?
Morpho Blue's liquidation process is really designed for pure, unadulterated efficiency. It uses a static LIF for each market, which is derived directly from that market's specific LLTV. It's simple, it's predictable for liquidators, but critically, Morpho Blue allows liquidators to repay the entire outstanding debt amount instantly if a position is liquidatable. There's no close factor constraint. You know how AA or Compound often cap the amount you can liquidate at maybe 50% of the debt per transaction?
Right, forcing multiple transactions to fully liquidate.
Morpho Blue doesn't have that. You can liquidate the whole thing at once. This structure strongly favors the lender because it encourages quick, complete liquidations as soon as a position becomes unhealthy. This leads to better collateral coverage overall and less chance of bad debt accumulating in the first place.
And that loss realization difference we keep coming back to also bears repeating here.
Yeah, absolutely. Morpho Blue itself accounts for bad debt instantly, socializing any losses immediately among lenders. This allows markets to theoretically run indefinitely without accumulating hidden, unrealized bad debt bombs. Traditional pools, on the other hand, often let that unrealized bad debt sit there.
Leading to potential instability or bank run dynamics if capital outflow suddenly accelerates and forces realization on the last few lenders out.
Exactly. And importantly, those Morpho vaults using the V1.0 adapter, they mimic that ideal instant socialization behavior of Blue, ensuring predictable loss distribution for their users. That's a major strategic advantage compared to pools where the last lender standing might bear the brunt of historically accumulated losses. Hashtag 5.2 Morpho vaults versus yield aggregators. Conceptual link.
Okay, last comparison. Morpho vaults, especially with that curator-allocator team dynamically shifting capital across different Morpho Blue markets. Conceptually, it sounds very similar to the function of a specialized yield aggregator, like Yearn or Beefy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How should we think about differentiating the reward and, maybe more importantly, the risk profile between them?
That's a really good comparison. The roles are functionally quite similar. Both aim to optimize passive yield for depositors by actively managing capital allocation. But the domain of risk they operate in is distinct. A standard yield aggregator, like Yearn, typically manages assets across multiple different protocols. They might lend on a Hov, provide liquidity on Curve, stake on Lido, maybe farm some new protocol's token. Their strategies often involve interacting with many different smart contract systems simultaneously.
Okay, so right away, a typical aggregator introduces multi-protocol smart contract risk if any one of those underlying protocols has a bug or gets exploited.
The aggregator's vault could be impacted, exactly. Plus, you have the heightened strategy risk associated with the aggregator's own complex deployment logic, how they move funds between these protocols, harvest rewards, manage impermanent loss, etc. The risk surface is quite broad and diverse.
So how does a Morpho vault differ in its risk profile then?
With a Morpho vault, your underlying protocol risk is singular. It's the audited, immutable Morpho Blue primitive. You're not exposed to the smart contract risk of Evolve and Compound and Curve all at once.
Okay, simpler base layer risk, but the operational risk gets concentrated elsewhere.
That's the trade-off. The Morpho Vault performance and safety are directly exposed to, one, the technical risk of its specific adapters, like the Metamorpho V1 adapter itself having a bug, and two, much more significantly, the strategic and governance risk of its management team, the curator, the allocator, the sentinel, and potentially those gate controllers.
So a Morpho vault is almost like a single protocol specialized yield aggregator.
That's a perfect way to put it. The user is essentially swapping broad, multi-protocol smart contract exposure for a more concentrated, specific governance and curation risk that sits directly on top of the trustless Morpho Blue base layer.
Which, for sophisticated users, might actually be preferable because it allows for much clearer, more focused due diligence on that single management team and their specific strategy, rather than trying to track the risks of 5 different protocols simultaneously.
Precisely. It narrows the focus of your trust assumptions. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. Okay. We've covered a lot of ground there. We navigated the core architectural decisions, Morpho Blue's trustless foundation versus the curated risk segregation offered by the vaults. We analyzed the surprisingly complex L2 gas market microeconomy to help you optimize transaction costs. And we really dove deep into the intensive due diligence required for vault safety, focusing on curator actions, time locks, and that critical inflation attack safeguard.
Yeah, the major decision points really become quite stark when you lay them out. Generally, you'll choose the vault layer for passive, risk-segregated lending, unless you're a very sophisticated integrator. You absolutely must prioritize due diligence on the curator-allocator actions and verify the mandatory use of time locks. When picking an L2, understand that stable fees might actually be found on networks like Arbitrum, countering the potential volatility of high-priority fee networks like Base, depending on your needs. And finally, recognize that while the Morpho protocol itself minimizes technical risk at the base layer, the vault system explicitly accepts a degree of governance risk, particularly related to the speed and mechanism of loss realization in some configurations.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Morpho fundamentally shifts the lending paradigm by externalizing risk, making it incredibly customizable. But this new modularity absolutely mandates that you, the user, must become an expert, not just in chasing yields, but deeply understanding the governance mechanics and the specific risks of the particular vault you choose to entrust your capital to.
hmm And this raises a really important practical question for every sophisticated lender using these systems. If that governance and curation layer is the primary source of operational risk, how should you actually price the value of certain safety features? For example, how much more valuable is a vault that demonstrably implemented a well-secured initial dead deposit, giving you that near-absolute shield against inflation attacks compared to the potential future cost or risk of maybe having to use that penalty-enforcing emergency exit function someday? It's a risk pricing exercise.
That's a fantastic point. Your final decision isn't just a simple choice between, say, Apuve and Morpho Blue anymore. It's really a choice of which specific set of semi-trusted risk managers, the curator and allocator team for a given vault you're willing to entrust with the critical governance risk that operates just above Morpho's immutable trustless primitive. Go deep, verify everything on chain, and happy and safe lending out there.